on. There we go. So now we're starting to record. So Robyn, if I'll let you take the lead and you can talk us through your study that you've just completed.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for asking me along, Ian. It's really nice to sort of do these kind of community talks, especially during, it's been such a long period of COVID, hasn't it? It's nice to actually interact with some people rather than just sitting in an office all day long. So yes, thank you for asking me along. And thank you for actually being inside on a day that's actually sunny for a change to come along to this. So I'm just going to run through some slides. I'm going to sort of talk about a project that I did recently, which we got funding from Leader and from Nature Scot. And you might be more familiar with the name SNH, so Scottish Natural Heritage rather than Nature Scot, but they changed their name just recently. And effectively what this organisation do, they're sort of like the government branch that reinforce kind of environmental protection, wildlife legislation, everything like that. So that's kind of what they're responsible for. And they gave us some money to take forward a project which was actually looking at reforming agri-environment schemes for common grazings. And this is part of like a wider sort of Scotland-wide approach, where they're actually looking at redeveloping agri-environment schemes, you know, for farmers, for crofters, now that we've actually come out of the EU. So I don't know, does everybody like have specifically a croft? Do you have livestock? Do you get any kind of subsidies, or do you sign up for any agri-environment schemes?
Well, we have a croft, but we haven't got any animals yet because we're doing, it's been neglected for such a long time. We're working on doing a polycrop and growing the veg and a workshop for my husband, but we're planting trees with the Woodland Trust in this next season.
Fantastic.
Alcrow has been to see us and we're down for 1,080. So if anybody wants to volunteer for any tree planting in the new year, you're more than welcome to come this way.
We've just planted, I think we had 300 trees that went down here. So I'm sure we can maybe get a few people to come round and give you a hand too.
Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah, but
Will
you're
you
also
provide lunch?
Yes, I'll provide cake, dinner.
I'll come. Yeah, so you're familiar with the fact that like you can have, you know, government subsidies which will help with supporting crofting, agriculture, everything like that. The project I was looking at was specifically looking at common grazings, because obviously like it really depends on the township, like how active people are, you know, out in the common, actually putting livestock out and everything like that. And it's something that's probably actually faced quite a significant decline over time. The use of the common grazing, people just don't have as much livestock as they used to. And actually this is quite a big concern, because a well-managed common grazing is actually a haven for wildlife, for, you know, rare plants, and it really offers like a huge amount of biodiversity and a huge amount of what we call ecosystem services. So this is just essential things like providing us with clean water, clean air, you know, sort of planting trees, all these things that just keep us having like a really healthy natural environment. And grazing and livestock is actually like quite an essential part of that, particularly in areas like the Outer Hebrides, where we have a lot of quite what we call sort of marginal agricultural land. So it's not really fertile, you know, we've got like a lot of peat bogs, a lot of sort of wet ground and everything like that. So it's not that easy for growing crops on, but you can actually have really good quality livestock reared in, you know, the land that we have here, sort of common grazings. But that's kind of fallen by the wayside. And I don't know, there's loads of studies done into, you know, why there's a decline in crofting, people getting into it, people staying in it. And I'm not here to answer those questions, because that's, you know, far beyond the scope of anything that I could really do. But this project was sort of looking at how we can make things better, how we can increase people's uptake of these kind of agri-environment schemes, to really kind of have more people engage in putting livestock out on the common grazing and managing it. in that kind of way. So that's what the project was. And let me just share my screen here. I'll try not to make things too boring by going through a PowerPoint presentation, but obviously it's just quite nice to actually have some pictures to look at rather than just my face. So you should sort of say, yeah, thank you to all the funders, like Leader out of Hebrides. You'll know they just get involved in so many fantastic projects, and they just really did give us a lot of support throughout this project. The project started in November 2019, and we had a whole plan for engaging with the community and having loads of meetings with, grazings committees, and then COVID happened. So you can imagine how well that went for us. So we ended up actually trying to do like a lot of things virtually, which is never, well, I think it's certainly been a learning curve for me, learning how to go and talk to people in a kind of digital space like this and really take forward ideas. And I think we've all sort of had to kind of learn how to do that. So we did get there in the end, but things didn't go to plan. But we did actually manage to sort of engage really well with a lot of common grazings. We covered all of the Outer Hebrides, so, Barra, the Uists, Lewis and Harris. And it was actually like really well received. But I should actually tell you what the project is first and foremost. So what I was saying about agri-environment schemes, traditionally, agri-environment schemes is you sign up for a 5-year scheme, you come out, you get told a list of things, like, so if you've got a common grazing which is good for like wader birds or for certain rare orchids, or it's good for certain raptors like birds of prey, then you can access money to help support land management for that. But traditional agri-environment schemes, you'd sort of sign up for 5 years, you'd maybe have an inspection at the start and an inspection at the end. And basically, if you fulfilled all the criteria you had to, then you'd get the money. And if you didn't get the money. So you can understand, like, it's quite a big commitment to sort of sign up for a scheme that lasts for 5 years. And you never are guaranteed that maybe you'd actually get the payment at the end of it. It's quite a difficult thing to do because obviously people pay out money and then have to claim it back. So it's a bit of a clunky system. I'm sure if you speak to any crofters, you speak to them about the Common Agricultural Policy, they'll tell you a few choice words, maybe about how well they think it actually runs. So leaving the EU, like, not great in a lot of ways, but in some, it does give the UK, and particularly obviously the Scottish Government, a real opportunity to look at how to run these kind of schemes better. So agri-environment schemes is obviously focusing specifically kind of on Scottish Government priorities for biodiversity loss and climate change. So I'm not going to cover ones that are maybe, looking at increasing yields or anything like that. That's not what the schemes we're talking about today focused on, specifically sort of biodiversity. And what they were doing is sort of trying to bring in a less prescriptive approach. So one that actually involves crofters, from the beginning, and gives them kind of more control, more flexibility about how they manage their own land. A lot of traditional kind of agri-environment schemes, they'd have like a set list of things you could do and you couldn't do, and you either did them or you didn't, and then that was it. There was no kind of flexibility, there was no kind of real understanding there. And now to Hebrides have, many unique things about them, and a lot of it is understanding how to manage land appropriately for what we have here, rather than maybe what somebody has in, sort of Wales or like Southeast England or something like that. So it's actually sort of saying, you can put stock out at the best time of year for the Outer Hebrides rather than, what it would be for somewhere different. And it's just making sure that it's really specific for where we are. So they adopted this new approach called results-based. And while it sounds maybe a little bit clunky, what it essentially means is that you're actually looking at what happens to the area that you're managing. So looking at the common grazings and seeing how it's improved. So you're actually looking at what the outcome is. So you're not sort of saying, like, is there more wader birds there, or are there more plants there? Although that is part of it. What we're saying is, like, how's the habitat improved? And actually looking at what's on the ground rather than, did you put your stock out at on the 12th of February and bring them in on the 17th of November or something. That's not what it's about. It's sort of saying we need to actually have a more realistic view of like how the livestock interacts with the environment and how you actually manage it better, because that's what counts. It's not about sort of ticking boxes and fulfilling dates. It's actually about what you see on the ground, and that's what results-based is really all about. It's actually sort of saying what's in front of you. Does that look better? Is that good management? Yes, then you should get paid fairly for it. And believe it or not, in the Outer Hebrides, I think common grazings cover 70% of all of our land. So there's a huge potential there, and even the Scottish Government recognises there's huge potential there for having a lot of benefits for biodiversity and for climate change. So there's a real recognition from the Scottish Government how important the Outer Hebrides are from helping them meet some of their international targets for biodiversity loss and tackling climate change. So it's really nice in some ways to have the Hebrides recognised for that value, and to actually start maybe being prioritised. And now they're sort of looking at these new results-based approaches. It's going to be a real change within the Scottish Government. But what they're doing is they're running several pilot schemes. So there's some, we've got Outer Hebrides, there's Shetland, there's our Gyle Hill farms, Skye, we've got Crofton by Strathspey, is sort of mixed livestock farming, East Lothian, in southwest Scotland. So they're sort of doing pilot studies all throughout Scotland to try and really get a better grasp of how we can have better agri-environment schemes, and making them sort of more locally targeted as well, and making sure that we actually sort of really work with crofters and farmers from the outset. So a results-based approach, and that's kind of rough introduction. And what that translates as is the creation of some habitat scorecards, where basically you can carry out a habitat assessment and you can have a score out of 100. And essentially that will give you like an idea of quality overall. Obviously sort of 0, low score, 100 is your kind of maximum score there. And it goes through like a list of questions, which will focus on specific things that people can measure, people can count. And the actual score you get is related to the payment that you get. So if the higher your score, the more money you get. And it means that even sort of people who have like a common grazing that's been neglected maybe for a few years, they can get a score of say 4 or 5, but then they'll have support to help them understand how to get to a higher score. Now, obviously, there's a real incentive there, not just for improving the condition of the habitat, but actually for people getting more money and getting paid more for the good work that they're doing. So that's kind of like the thinking behind results-based and what they're about. What we're sort of looking at when we talk about a result is just basically a better habitat for a certain bird species or an increased number of species in a grassland, so increasing sort of biodiversity. So it's really simple kind of measures of habitat quality that we're looking for. Like I was saying, the scorecard that gets created is specific for the habitat type you're looking at. So for the Outer Hebrides, would have a bog scorecard, a macro scorecard, one for wader-grazed grasslands, which tends to sort of be, in townships, and just sort of hill farms, everything like that. So some areas which have been kind of improved historically. And I just skip over that wee bit there. And you basically sort of pick out the priorities and how you can improve it and why it's important. So you can imagine the Outer Hebrides is actually just stuffed full of, rare habitats, rare species. And when we came to actually start this project, to deciding like how we'd put together the scorecards, it was incredibly difficult to pinpoint what we would focus on, just because there's so many rare species. We've got white-tailed eagles, we've got, all the wader species, so, oyster catchers, curlew, there's a great yellow bumblebee, which I'm sure some of you must be familiar with, being down in Harris, in terms of how rare they are and how much they're linked to macher. So really, you know, like you're spoiled for choice in Hebrides, I suppose I should say, and a lot of Lewis, Harris, and in the Eusts as well. These maps that I'm showing you just now are essentially all the environmental protection designations, and obviously, like everything that has you know, a colour on it is an area of land that is protected for habitat or for particular species, and you can see more or less all of the Outer Hebrides is covered. So I mean, that's how valuable biodiversity and habitats are in the Outer Hebrides. It's I think people sometimes don't realise like how many rare species we actually have here, because we live here and it's really easy just to think, oh, I'm going down the shops, you know, it's no big deal. But actually when you take a step back, we have some of the rarest habitats here in the world. And we just don't realise it. So like I was saying, once we eventually managed to kind of narrow our focus down, we selected 4 scorecards. Like I was saying, bog habitats, macher, a general habitat, which is kind of just like a catch-all for everything that didn't quite fit into all these other ones. And so that'd be sort of a mix of more heathy habitats, so really heather-dominated habitats, and wadder grazed grassland. So that would be sort of ones that you maybe associate more with the croft and sort of township parks. And this here is an example of a scorecard, but I don't want you to worry about this too much. It's just to give you an idea of what the project was and how it actually sort of works. And I've got some other pictures which will actually kind of translate what these words mean into what you'd actually see on the ground. And then hopefully even just running through this today, next time you're out and about driving, you can look at an area of habitat nearby and go like, oh, I think that's probably really good quality because of X, Y, and Z. You know, quite often we talk about that's good habitat or that's maybe poor quality, and we don't actually know why. So that's what the scorecards are about, is about actually trying to pick out the different kind of factors which make something good quality habitat. And I should say, we obviously didn't focus on species, so you wouldn't say this area of common grazing it would be good maybe for curlews or for oyster catchers or for lapwing, but these birds, they fly about. You know, you wouldn't want to turn around and say somebody could only get paid for improving habitat for these birds if the birds were found there, just because they move about. You might go out and look for them in a day where, you know, they're somewhere else. So we're very much looking at things that don't move, like plants, and like looking at sort of height of grass, height of vegetation, simple things that people can actually look for themselves, and that you know, like you don't have to be an expert to understand, because it's quite difficult maybe if people are expected to look at and identify different plant species or bird species or whatever. We want to try and make it as simple as possible, because the idea with the scorecards is once this new scheme kind of gathers momentum, and I'll come on to that at the end just to sort of see where we are with it now, that it would be crofters or farmers that can actually use the scorecards themselves. So how it works just now is quite often you'd maybe get a consultant to come out and do your kind of assessment with you, and then they'd put in an application form to the Scottish Government, and then you'd find out whether or not you get money or not. Whereas with this, it means that the actual township could do it themselves and probably save themselves a couple of £1,000s to not actually have the consultant come out and do it. So it's very much putting the control back in the crofters' hands if they want to go on and actually sort of take part in these agri-environment schemes. So just a couple of quick things to point out for the scorecard here. You can see really straightforward. It's sort of broken into 3 sections. So we'd look at what we call ecological integrity. So that's just making sure that you've got a good mix of plants which are positive for that habitat that you expect to find there. Ones that, you know, indicate really good biodiversity. So you can see, first question here, A1, how many positive indicators are present? And from that, you maybe got a list of, you know, 50, 60 species, because this scorecard is looking at macher. So you'd expect to find, you know, countless numbers of good plants that you'd want there. And you'd also want to sort of look at the cover of those plants. So are they found in just one tiny wee patch, or are they kind of found throughout all of the common grazing? And the same as we'd maybe sort of look for some plants that flower later in the year, just because we like to have the chance for the plants to flower and set seed. Because when that happens, it means, oh, we're all gardeners, you'll know fine well, that they have a really good seed stock in the soil, and it means that they'll flower next year as well. So that's kind of thinking behind it. I'll actually just skip ahead, give you a visual image of what positive indicators means. So that's, you can see it's maybe got quite scientific language in some ways, but that's just because that's a protocol that's recognised. And once, you know, maybe some people get training in it, you understand the kind of terminology used. But yeah, positive indicators just means, are there lots of, you know, native wildflowers, good species which are good for bumblebees, for moths, for everything like that. That's what we want to see. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Hoosnish, and like that's a very typical Macher scene, just a sea of wildflowers, lots of grass, and it's all sort of grown quite long. If it was really heavily grazed, you'd actually find plants which are maybe kind of this sort of size, but we don't find that here. They're actually sort of much taller, and it's all looking very healthy and very natural, and it's got a really good cover there as well. Like I was saying, they're not just in little patches. Next is sort of looking at some species that we'd want to see, ones that would flower later on in the year. So here we've got some harebell, some yarrow, some devil's bit scabious. I don't know, is anybody like a particularly good at flower identification here? Are you all familiar with these species?
Nope.
No.
I'm going to say nope straight away.
I think we see all of those on the map in Northton, I think.
Oh, definitely in Northton. I'm sure you will, without a doubt. Northton's really good. It scored very, very highly on any of the scorecards. But it's so easy to like walk past these species and not realise maybe how important they were for bumblebees or anything like that. And obviously,
what is the yellow one at the big
yellow one at the bottom? So this is there's a lot of plants that look really like this. So we'd specifically say not dandelion.
Yeah.
But this is a hawkbit or a hawkweed. So like a yellow kind of flowering plant. So they're very similar to dandelion, but they tend to flower later on in the year. So they're actually still quite an important nectar source for, you know, pollinating insects and everything like that. So that's why they're still included there. But the harebell, so the one that you can see up here, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Yarrow is
lots of those on the Scarista golf course.
On the golf course, yeah.
And they're wonderful to see, aren't they? But they tend to sort of flower later on in the year. The same with this sort of purple globe one, Devil's Bit Scabious. It's got quite
we get loads of them down at Borisdale.
Yeah, it quite likes wet ground. So it's one of the reasons, yeah, if Borisdale's quite wet, then you'll get a lot of Devil's Bit there. And obviously red clover at the bottom. Another familiar one, but obviously pollinating insects, absolutely love it. It's really good for them. So yeah, that's all the really good positive indicators you want to look out for. Another really important factor for thinking about Macher is actually sort of looking at where it meets the sea, where it meets the beach and everything like that. Just because, you know, one thing we get a lot of here is a lot of wind and wave action, and actually like the marram grass forms a really important kind of physical protection against those elements. And maybe it's not something that is faced quite as much in Harris, but certainly in the Uists, they have a lot of coastal erosion, and some of that is because the marram isn't in particularly good condition.
I think Sheelabost here in Harris has maybe some of that issue. There's a lot of erosion happened there.
Yeah.
So.
And quite often it's, I mean, we say it's maybe down to being overgrazed. I mean, like marram isn't, if you've walked through marram, it's painful, isn't it? It's like a really rough grass. So like actually livestock wouldn't eat it that much. They'd maybe eat some in the summer when there's fresh growth. So you'd have to have like a really high stocking density. There'd have to be a lot of livestock in an area to really graze the marram. You can see the picture with the fence post there. It's sort of on the left hand side you can see where the grass hasn't, the marram hasn't been grazed, and on the right hand side where it has been grazed, and you can obviously see bare patches of sand as well. So that's when you know you've probably got too many livestock in an area, when you can kind of see that. And actually really what you want is marram grass, which is more like the left hand side here, where it's, you can see it's in flower, you can see there's lots of growth there, because how marram grows is it sort of sends out rhizomes like along the soil surface, and it more or less sort of creates this net which keeps all the sand in, and it just creates that really good barrier between the sea and the rest of the macher. So when the marram's in good condition, it's probably a good indication for the rest of the habitat as well. But it's a really essential component of it, and sometimes it's overlooked. Certainly in old agri-environment schemes, they'd only look at, say, like the number of plant species in the actual macher grassland. Whereas with this new scheme, we're really trying to bring in the fact that you need that coastal buffer in order to kind of protect things, because we want to think long term. We don't just want to think what's here right now. We want to sort of really encourage people to improve the habitats in a more sustainable way that's going to actually really benefit it for generations to come. You know, because the decisions we make now do actually impact, you know, 5, 10, 20 years down the line. And it's just really good to kind of bring that in now, and just make people more aware of it as well. Okay. Other things we were saying, so we've got positive indicators, we'd also have some negative indicators. So species to look out for. Again, these will probably all be very familiar to you, but I'll also just explain quickly why. So left-hand side, here we've got some creeping thistle. We know what it's like. As soon as there's a bit of disturbed ground, creeping thistle can run riot. And if it's allowed to sort of set seed, then you're basically pulling it up for, you know, months, years to come, just because it's so prolific at growth. And it tends to indicate an area which has been disturbed. So maybe there's been some dumped soil, or there's been lots of livestock in there and churned up the soil. So it's generally not a good thing for an area of macher. You wouldn't want that. But we want people to be able to, you know, have a look out and see, oh, if I see lots of creeping thistle, there's probably something not quite right with that management. We need to think about what's going on here. So they're just a really good species to look out for, to give you a clue that maybe things could be managed better. So that's the idea behind it. The middle picture here, it's not a great photo, unfortunately, but this is some ragwort. And again, similar to creeping thistle, once ragwort pops up, it can just run riot. And it tends to really dominate a habitat if there's really heavy grazing during the summer months, because ragwort can be sort of outcompeted by other plants quite easily, as long as those other plants have a chance to grow. So it tends to be, again, a sign of sort of overgrazing during the summer. In macher, we actually want the summer to kind of almost have the lightest grazing possible, you know, so you'd want it to kind of, the macher to be its lushest and its longest kind of July, well, sort of June right through to maybe August, September time, because that's when most of the plants are in flower. And that's basically the best time to actually kind of get an idea. It's when most of the wildflowers come out as well. So if you to see like a ton of ragwort, you know that wouldn't be good, because it would really impact on the overall diversity of the grass there, of the grassland. And the last picture is some perennial rye grass. And this, obviously it's great for livestock to feed on, but macher grassland is traditionally quite low nutrient. It's not like, obviously they'd use seaweed as fertilizer on it. So you're not going to have like a lot of fertilizer or nitrogen in there. And if you see a lot of perennial ryegrass, it's probably an indication that there has been, you know, an inorganic fertilizer used, or it's been sort of improved. And that really doesn't help wildflowers at all. And they actually do really quite badly if there's too much enrichment of the soil. So that's why we sort of pick out these kind of species to say, this is not how you'd want to get the best out of a macher grassland. And that's kind of what they indicate. Now, does that all make sense? Has anybody got any questions just now? No, all makes sense?
Yeah, it all makes sense, but I just wondering, you know, the creeping thistle?
Yes.
Well, I have an abundance of it this year, because we've had our drive and ditches done, so the land has been disturbed, and wherever the land has been disturbed, the creeping thistle is just everywhere. We didn't have it that much of it last year, or noticeably, but we have this year on the croft. And have you any suggestions of managing that?
The best thing you can do is just try and keep on top of it. Make sure that it doesn't have a chance to set seed. So just basically hand pull it. I mean, it's up to you if you put down any kind of
No, I don't.
herbicides. No, I mean, I personally wouldn't either. So yeah, it's just basically some elbow grease, pull them out and make sure it doesn't set seed.
I'm doing that at the moment. So every time I go out, there's another bucket full, but then there's far too much to go in the compost, and somebody's recommended not putting it on my compost heap either.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it in your compost. Yeah. I think it's one of those things. It's so good at persisting in the environment. You're better just like saying, okay, I'm gonna just get rid.
So where I've pulled it up from in certain places, would you suggest if I seeded some yellow rattle that would help combat it next year?
So now yellow rattle tends to be semi-parasitic on grasses.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how it would be for creeping thistle.
No.
Just because obviously like yellow rattle works really effectively for helping kind of like suppress grass growth. But I wonder if in some ways actually the grass growing might help
Suppress
some of the creeping thistle. So I'm not 100% sure. There's quite a few factors going on there, Sue, as to what, how you'd manage that.
Maybe if I pull it and put grass seed down.
Yeah, or because you want something to grow there, so the ground isn't disturbed and it's not, open for the creeping thistle to kind of.
There was a lot of on our croft, like I say, it's been not managed for many years, but it has an awful lot of meadow sweet on it, and that is still coming up. But the creeping thistle is in areas where last year the meadow sweet would have been.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if I pull up the thistle, I wonder if the meadow sweet would move in, even though it's already started to grow now.
Oh, again, meadow sweet tends to favour quite damp soil. So if you've got ditches in, you might have kind of sorted that issue already. They do really tend to focus on wetter areas.
Yeah.
So that might be, you might have solved that problem, but yeah, just have to deal with the creeping thistle afterwards.
Is it all right to have the meadow sweet?
I think meadow sweet is a really nice plant to have. Yeah. It's certainly very good for biodiversity. It's very good for pollinators.
Yeah.
I mean, it can kind of dominate an area, which is the only thing to think about. So you might have to sort of be really quite on top of like cutting it back sometimes. Like normally we'd suggest if you had like a lot of meadow sweet that the area wasn't being grazed sufficiently by livestock.
It hasn't been grazed for years.
Yeah.
So
you could sort of control it manually just by taking it away.
Just speaking about that, we're obviously going to be having some big building work done at our site, and that wee thistle is rife. It's everywhere, and we're looking to have our polytunnel built up. And I'm just wondering, can you recommend, is there any seeds or anything I can put down just so we can have a nice area, a nice welcoming, whether it's wildflowers or if it's any of these species that we could put down? Is there anything that would be worthwhile, or is it just to be going with any other seeds?
You can get sort of packets of wildflower seeds. There's a really good company called Scotia Seeds.
Yes.
And they basically
I've been in touch with them, and I was talking to her because I said I didn't want to introduce a flower that wasn't supposed to be here, and she said that she was very glad that I'd mentioned that lots of people don't do, and she would work out a mix for you that is more indigenous to the area. I haven't yet got any of this because I'm not at that stage, but I think that she would be very interested to deal with you, Ian, and to help you get the right mix of stuff. She also said that she doesn't want her seeds going to the wrong places either, as much as you don't want the wrong, because she said a lot of people just buy the seed and chuck it out and they think and hope for the best. So I think that they were their approach was very good and quite scientific.
Great. That sounds
Absolutely.
like something that could be quite good, and it kind of fits in with our whole model as well of that. So that sounds quite
So
interesting.
Scotia Seeds do mixes, but they also do sort of like single species packets as well. So I got some corn marigold, Bit Scabius, and some corn some ragged robin as well, the little pink flowers that you quite often see. And I've put them in the garden and just now sort of have this maybe sort of 5 meter by 1 meter strip of wildflowers just in front of her deck. And it looks wonderful.
Oh, brilliant.
Absolutely wonderful.
When...
And don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of pulling up horsetails, but it's getting there, you know, and I think it's going to be a couple of years of investment of my time just keeping an eye on it. But I'm really, really happy with it. And all the seeds, they came from Scotia Seeds. So you can do it sort of either way, but you like the idea of making sure that the type you get, the species you get, is appropriate to the area, because a lot of them might not actually even grow that well here. Because we
so they'll sort out as in what kind of area you're planted into, whether it's a wet, boggy area or if it's sandy area. They'll kind of sort that out for you.
They'd certainly give you advice on it, Ian, if you were to phone them up and say, this is what we're doing, this is where we're at, and the kind of area as well. They give you an idea maybe of how many seeds would be ideal to kind of sow with the area that you've got, and they can actually make you up bespoke mixes. Certainly when I worked for Glasgow University, they used to make up mixes for some of the grassland restoration works that we were doing there, actually within Glasgow, and they'd make sure that it was of local relevance. You wouldn't be bringing in species that you'd normally get down in the south of England or whatever. It was all species that you'd find in Scotland and in that kind of central belt area as well. So I'm sure they do the same for you guys.
I think when I contacted her, it said, I'm asking you for help rather than me actually purchasing yet. So I think they're happy to work alongside you and see what is best for you. And I think that they're happier to do that rather than just sell you a bucket of seed.
Which is great.
I think if you contact them and say, help, I don't know what I'm doing, I think they're quite happy to really help you out.
Excellent.
They're really, really nice.
Can I just ask a quick question about ragwort?
Sure.
Having spent years and years pulling it all out, I read recently that, is it the cinnabar moth, the red and black moth? Needs it. So is there a case for having a little bit of St. John's wort around the place?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you can't sort of be
sorry, not St. John's wort, ragwort.
Ragwort. You can't be absolutist. You can't sort of say you can't have even like the one flower of ragwort, because it's part of the natural system. And we obviously do have species which we value, which will use it, obviously for the caterpillars. And that's part of it's. I don't want to go into too much detail into the scorecards because it'd be a lot to take in. But we do, like, there's certain like cutoff points for like the sort of percentage of, say, ragworts or creeping thistle or other negative indicators you can have within an area before you'd actually get a score, maybe a negative score or something like that, just because it does exist. It's natural, and we're not here to say it must be completely taken away. I mean, if you had something like rhododendron growing, we might have a different attitude then, or maybe something like gunnera, because these species are really bad news as soon as they get established. But something like ragwort or creeping thistle, some of them completely natural, you just don't want it to take over. You know, so quite often they're there to indicate there's something not quite right with management. Keep an eye on it, but it's not a case of this is bad, you've got to, you know, burn it to the ground or anything like that. It's very much like just keep an eye on things. And there's sort of different degrees of, you know, negative impact from different species. Like I was saying, you know, rhododendron or gunnera, they can be really bad news. But yeah, like a bit of ragwort, nobody would be upset about that, because it is, yeah, good for cinnabar. The other pollinating insects will use them, so you wouldn't want to just take it out for the sake of taking it out.
That's just reminded me of something else. Rhododendrons. Is it true that they're poisonous to bees? There was something on Facebook the other day.
Oh, I mean, I'm not 100% sure. Like what I'm more familiar with rhododendron is that it's actually the kind of soil conditions that they produce. You know, obviously that it more or less prevents any other species from growing, and they can form like a really dense canopy, and again sort of outshade everything else. I think, I mean, I'm not sure like how much pollen or nectar, or well, nectar that they produce, which is good for pollinating insects, but I don't think I've heard of them being poisonous to bees before. So no, like but I'm not 100% sure. Like I'm not an expert on rhododendron and latest.
Thanks.
Can I just ask you about the yellow bumblebee?
The great yellow bumblebee, yeah.
Yeah. I'm very interested in it, but I don't know very much about it. Do you know much about it?
I know a fair bit about it. I'll hopefully be able to answer your question.
So, well, I'm very interested because when I came here originally to take over the craft, I said about keeping bees. I'm kind of changing my mind now because of what little I've found out about the great yellow bumblebee is that if you keep honeybees, it's not very good for the great yellow bumblebee, because the honeybees are a bit like a grey squirrel and a red squirrel. The honeybee would act like the grey squirrel and eradicate the yellow bumblebee, and that it would be better, rather than being a beekeeper, to plant the right plants for the bee that you're trying to help. Is that, in your opinion, is that right?
I mean, I think so. You're in Northton, are you?
Yes, yeah, right near the Maca.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, given where your croft is, that there's actually it's probably pretty likely that you have great yellow bumblebees right beside you, and potentially even coming into the croft. So they actually have, like, they emerge quite late, you know, so the queens maybe come out sort of May time, and then they need to have all these wildflowers. So you could really benefit them by having flowers that come that grow really early in the season. So they've got like early nectar sources, which would be really good for them. I mean, I'm not sure. There'd obviously be some competition between honeybees and great yellow bumblebees if you were to have like a particularly large hive. But I mean, I think if you're talking about having just a small number of hives yourself, I'm not sure like how much of a negative impact that would have on great yellow bumblebees. You could certainly, yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're not planning on having like 100, you know, hives or anything like that. You might have a small, like 2 or 3 or something. Yeah. And I would imagine that there's enough flowering plants in the Macha to support that. Right. And providing obviously you're thinking about, you know, you wouldn't want to have ginormous hives or number of hives. But yeah, like sort of planting early flowering species for early nectar sources would be really good for great yellow bumblebee, and just making sure, I suppose, that there's just, I suppose you don't graze the Macha or anything like that. I mean, it's just great yellow bumblebees need good quality Macha habitat, and that's basically what keeps them right, you know. And that's what you have at Northton. Like, Northton's fantastic in a lot of ways. And I think a small number of hives, I would find it hard to believe that that would have such a detrimental impact on them.
Yeah. And what would you suggest for early nectar sources planting?
So early nectar sources, like certainly bird's foot trefoil. So again, you want to go for native ones. Bird's fruit trefoil is very good. Lesser celandine is very good as well. But basically, I mean, you know yourself, like things can flower really late in the season.
Yeah.
They can start really late. I mean, everything. We had Cuckoo Flower. Again, that's a really good one. Cuckoo Flower is sort of very early flowering plant. Again, likes wet places. It's important kind of early season nectar source. But our Cuckoo Flower is still in flower here. And it's
Right.
supposed to normally come out like March, April time, and that's as well into June, and it's still in flower because obviously we had such a cold spring and such a late start to the growing season. But those species, yeah, they do really well to have those. But it's really dependent on how what kind of spring we have as to how early these things come into flower. But yeah, bird's fruit trefoil, because quite often if it does well, it can grow in quite big mats. And obviously it's this beautiful yellow flower, so it's nice to have around.
Yeah. And what do you think about comfrey? Is that too invasive? Because I seem to have an abundance of that the bees absolutely love it.
I think if the bees love it, then that's good enough for me.
It is for me, but I just thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've got like a wonderful croft. It sounds like there's loads of really good things going on here.
Well, we're trying to make it like that. So to grow the right ones, I don't want to do the wrong thing if we can help it. So.
Oh no, it sounds like you're well ahead of the game, definitely. Okay, well, I finish up with these scorecards. This chat's far too interesting. Yeah. Okay, so like I was saying, other things to look out for, things that we know is not good for macher. We see some bare patches of ground. You can see that the grass here is really overgrazed. You know, it's very, very short. You're sort of talking this kind of height. I should state that these photos were taken in July. So if you saw macher like this, and it was say November, October time, or October, November time, you would think that's fine, because traditional management of macher is heavily grazed, probably over like autumn into winter. That is fine. It's part of a natural system. You have, you know, poaching from hooves, from livestock, and that's totally natural. But if you were to see macher like this in, you know, middle of summer when it should be looking its best, so if you think back to, I'll look it back, this is what we'd want to see. This is good macher when everything's growing, everything's doing really well. Whereas if you look at this in comparison, you know, you can see they're worlds apart. Hardly any plants are growing here. There's loads of bare ground. That's bad news. Macher shouldn't look like this at all. It's just been heavily overgrazed, probably for a number of years as well. And again, heavy grazing over the summer. We've got the ragwort showing there. It's a sure sign that it's just not been well managed, unfortunately.
I know that middle photo very well. So I know a lot of people put their sheep there. So yeah.
Oh, don't tell them I was slagging them off. Like, oh
no. I'll keep quiet.
Okay. The same with the far right photo. Obviously, there's been some sand extraction that's happened here, and again, you can see as soon as there's wind, there's rain, a lot of that sand's going to blow away. It's going to start eating around the margins where the grass is, and just start sort of breaking down the soil. And quite often, once you have an area like this, it's really hard to contain and to manage. You can think like, how long will it take for plants to start growing in that soil to stabilize it, in the sand to stabilize it? It never really gets a chance. So these are the kind of things that you'd look out for.
That was the, sorry to interrupt, that was the question I was going to ask, was that photo on the far right, how do you manage that? How can you stop the erosion or at least slow it down even more? Is there anything?
One of the things you can see just now is obviously there's still livestock going through it. You can see that from the hoof prints. So essentially what you might end up doing is getting an electric fence. So like one of the kind of movable ones, and set that up around it, because quite often, like Macher is a very dynamic system. It can recover really quite quickly if it's given the chance to. I mean, with an area quite that large, it would take years to kind of restabilize. But you could do things like actually maybe put over some netting, everything like that, just to sort of give the chance, the plants a chance to kind of start growing in it and restabilizing it. But it would just, like the successional process would just take a little while for that to actually happen. But it's a tough one. It'd be quite a difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah, because I was just thinking about Sheila Beach. That's the erosions there. Just it's crazy. Like there's large parts of land there that have been lost. And I'm not talking about land loss over 10, 15 years. I'm talking about like two or less years.
Wow.
It's pretty scary.
And is it sand extraction, Ian, or is it?
I don't know. See, we moved home in November, so I noticed it from when I was home last in August, and it was like a lot of it had just been gone. So I don't know if it's sand extraction. I don't think so. I know there's a couple of locals that will have their sheep on it there for certain parts of the year. I
mean, it might be that it's if it's quite close to the sea, and it's tidal action. It's maybe just like, I mean, there's some things that we can control and manage, and some things which we can't. And the sea is one of them that we definitely can't. You know, we can do the best we can by maintaining like the marram grass. And by trying not to sort of overgraze things. But if we have big Atlantic storms or anything like that, like there's really nothing we can do about that. And so it might just be, it's actually part of a natural process of erosion. And people can maybe put that down to climate change and changes in sort of, you know, weather patterns or more severe storms. So unfortunately, don't have an answer or a solution for that one, apart from maintain the marram grass. And we obviously have to think about things that are within our control that we can positively benefit. But yeah, like it's always quite concerning to see big areas of land just kind of disappear into the sea.
I was looking to ask you, your work with local farmers, are a lot of them signing up to that work, to the land management stuff?
So we've had quite a lot of interest, because obviously the project was developing these scorecards. So I spent months going out, looking at common grazings, noting down what species are good, types of management, what issues were, and just trying to get an idea of like how do you put that into words, you know, because that's actually quite hard. And then the idea is that because this is part of a pilot scheme, that we're involving a small number of common grazings committees in the pilot, and then they obviously can go out and test out the scorecards, because they're not finished yet. You know, you need to obviously actually see how much management responds to the different kind of criteria that you set out. Is it really practical, like what we're asking? So the idea is that this pilot will run until sort of maybe 2024, and that in that time we have, you know, our small group of grazings committees in the pilot that can input into it. So we do training with them, test out the scorecards, and see what they think of being involved in this scheme, because we want to make sure that actually it's tried and tested before it's rolled out any further. And it's great. So the common grazings, we've got Scalpy common grazings, so they're taking part in the pilot, as are Arnold, and hopefully actually Hushnish as well. And then we've got Borv Bernery, we have Ben Kenneth General, so down South Uist, and I think Brunish and Barra as well. But I left the project at the end of November, just because funding had run out. So as far as I'm aware, those are still the common grazings which will take part in the pilot, and I hope I hope to maybe get a couple more, but the idea is that, you know, the organisations that are taking it forward, so that's Nature Scot, will work with the common grazings, test out the pilot and test out the scorecards, and then kind of tweak them here and there and figure out like how well it works. And then kind of feed into the larger pilot schemes, like I was saying, you know, the Shetland one, Argyll, everything like that, and just sort of seeing like how well does this new results-based approach work. And I think, you know, we've had a lot of positive interest from the Scottish Government. Like the results-based schemes have been used really successfully in Ireland, and in some other countries in Europe as well. They work really, really well, and I think it's because it's giving control and ownership back to the people that actually manage the land, and more flexibility. And the idea that, you know, you've got your scorecard, you get a score out of 100, and depending on your score, will link to the payment that you're given. So there's a really good incentive there to increase the score if you want to, but if you don't, if you're happy with, you know, half of what you could potentially be paid, and that's enough, that's entirely your choice as well. It's not sort of such an absolute all or nothing, you know, because the idea is that you want to try and do as much good with the money that you have. And so instead of just having only like the best being able to enter an agri-environment scheme, you want to have as many people as possible take part, because then you actually will benefit biodiversity and climate change and all these things more by having more people take part. It's not good if it's just like a small honeypot area which gets loads of funding and that's perfect and everything else is kind of not so good. So that's the idea, is to make it more accessible to people by making it simpler. I don't know if anybody's ever filled out an AICS application form or put in funding. Like they're very long, and you know they're sort of quite, they're not a lot of fun to fill out. And I think, you know, the scorecard is like 2 sides of A4, and the idea is that that is all you need for your application as well. You don't need to have like a 20-page document, so it should be just opening up to people more widely. And obviously they're advertising a project officer post for the Outer Hebrides, and they're also doing one for the rest of the pilots as well. So they're going to have a number of project officers taking this forward. So that's really good. You know, it's also bringing jobs to the Hebrides for people to actually go out and do this. And I really hope someone local gets the job as well, because I think that really benefit the project by having somebody who understands common grazings and crofting to kind of take it forward. And they'll, I think, you know, it'll be, I'm trying to think when it runs to, is it maybe July next year? And they'll just be sort of maybe going for additional funding to continue the pilot studies as well. So it seems like the Scottish Government's putting like a lot of thought into developing this new approach. And I think it's a real opportunity, you know, for crofters, for us to have our say at this really early stage in the development, and to actually, if it needs to be tweaked, if it needs to be changed, then they can have that input now. And it's just great that we have our own grazing committees actually having direct input into that process.
Yeah, we actually had a chat last week with Donald McKinnon. And he's exactly what you said there. He's a big fan of how this could move forward. But I was just wondering, so see how you've got multiple scorecards. Is funding relative to one scorecard, or could somebody who has their sheep in different areas, are they able to tap into multiple pools of funding? So as in, they may have sheep on a boggy area, they may have their cattle or whatever on a more macher type area. Like, is funding linked to the area is what I mean.
No, it's a great question, Ian. So what you want is to have management across all of the common grazing, because, you know, quite often if you focus, say, just purely on macher, then maybe it's the boggy areas that suffer, because, you know, you're looking after macher really well, but dumping everything else on the bog. And that's not what we want. We want sort of like a whole unit approach. So people will look at the entire common grazing and think about how it's managed right throughout the year. So not just, you know, like when it has to look really good for inspection or anything, but just right throughout the year. And that's kind of what we want. It's not just ticking a box and saying, oh, we're doing everything that the Scottish Government's told us to get our money. It's saying, we understand how we manage the common grazing to make it really good for biodiversity, for ourselves, and for, you know, future crofters, you know, our kids coming in to actually manage it. So what you'd have is people can use multiple scorecards for the whole common grazing. So basically, if you've got some macher and you've got some bog and you've got some wadder graze grassland, you'd use all 3 cards. But what you do is actually calculate the area of the habitat that you have, and obviously payments are linked to area. So the more land you have, say if you've got 20 hectares of bog, then you'd work out, you know, how many, whatever payment you get per hectare of bog, and it's the same per hectare of macher. So the scores are, yeah, so they're all linked there, and that's
so payments aren't made to individual farmers, it's made to the actual area, and then it'll be
it's made to the common
spread
grazing.
throughout. Yeah, okay. I
To the committee, yeah. And then how that's subdivided out, because obviously there can be depending on what different individuals are more involved in the common grazing can depend on how the payments are made as well. These kind of things, you know, like the payment scheme and the amount of money, like sort of payment per hectare for different types of habitat, is still in the process of being worked out. You know, it really depends on the Scottish Government and, you know, obviously Westminster in terms of how much money, what kind of budget they give for these kind of schemes. And obviously, like, I'm far too low down in the pecking order to have any idea what that could possibly be. But, you know, like, it's up to them. But I think there's quite a lot of concern from crofters and farmers because, like, the current agri-environment schemes, AICs, they didn't find out until the start of this year, like, whether or not it was going to continue for another year. And obviously a lot of common grazings, a lot of crofters are really reliant on that money to actually still keep going. And they just had no idea if, like, they'd have any money to keep managing their croft or the common grazing. But they managed to they're doing like another year of funding, but it's very sort of specific things that they're going to fund. And like, it was not sort of quite as wide a number of schemes that they'd normally offer. So they're really moving towards maybe a more results-based. But for a while there, people were like, are they just going to stop funding this? And they didn't know. So I think it's good that we're moving in the right direction. It just, these things take time. Certainly when you involve like the government and things, it just takes time because it's such a big organisation for these things to filter through and be tested adequately and have enough buy-in from the, you know, community and experts and science and everything like that. It's just sort of bringing it all together. And I think, like, I really see the value in this results-based scheme, just because it does give control back to the people who are actually managing, you know, the croft or the common grazing. And I really hope it, you know, will incentivise grazings committees to become more active again and to really kind of reevaluate the value of the land that they have. Because so often if you look at like an area of bog, they're like, it's just bog, it's not worth anything. But actually, bog is vitally important in terms of carbon, for peat, for climate change. It's really, really valuable. So we're sort of trying to change people's perception of what they think is important as well, and to sort of value it slightly differently when they realise that they have like a little bit more information about what it's actually its real value is. Yeah.
Perfect, great. Does anybody else have any more questions?
How do you think you can get a grazings committee on board with this once it's rolled? Obviously not in the pilot because you've already got those, but once you roll out the scheme, how do you think you can get a grazings committee on board with this?
Money. Money.
I'm just thinking that from like, we've been here 2 years and obviously there's been a pandemic, so that's made a massive difference to how lots of things work, but we have never ever had a meeting yet from the Crofting Association, from the Grazings Committee or anything. But as an incomer and and they're very the crofters that are here crofting traditional, and they're very set in their ways of doing things. So it's very intimidating for somebody as an incomer to go along and suggest things like this, because that's not how we do things. So it's quite difficult to convince them, you know, to look into something like this other than the money aspect. And yes, I think the less forms they have to fill out, the better.
Yeah, you're right. So obviously I was being quite glib when I said money, but you're right. There's a lot of social and cultural factors which really come into, you know, getting people on board, trying something completely new, you know, that they've not come across before. It's a big shift in behaviour, isn't it? Particularly when tradition is something which is very important here. You know, I don't have
don't want to upset the apple cart, so to speak, but
no, I think you're right. All we can do is try and work with crofters and communities as closely as we can from the start, like help people feel involved. But ultimately, you know, it's someone's or a committee's personal choice as to whether they see the value in it or not, and that's not something that we can force. But I do think, you know, there's a growing awareness of, you know, biodiversity loss, climate change, and I think we're all more aware of the difference that we can make on a personal basis, you know, like as a community, as an island. And I think that is filtering through. But in terms of changing everyone's opinion, I think that's impossible. But no, like I really hear what you're saying in terms of bringing everyone on board, because that's probably one of the most challenging aspects of this.
yeah, thank you.
Has anybody got anything else to ask? Does anybody want to know anything about what we've spoken about? Or no?
We should just have talked about plants all day. That would have been great. Can we do another one where I don't have to speak?
What have you got coming up, Robyn?
So for me, like I actually have a quite interesting. Well, Ian knows I've been working on developing a wildlife festival for the Outer Hebrides, and this is with RSPB, and it'll hopefully run next year. And it's basically just about engaging the community more with outdoors and outdoor events, wildlife, so going out to see whales and dolphins and going out in the macher, looking at the plants, everything like that. We're doing a lot of stuff with local schools. We're getting kids to be wildlife ambassadors for different Hebridean species. So we've got some schools which are going to be adopting great yellow bumblebee, which is good. Or they're going to adopt some lapwing and corncrake and all the species that we really love and value in the Hebrides. So that's one of the things that I'm doing just now. And then after that, I'll be starting a new job with RSPB. So sort of looking at being a species and habitats officer for Scotland. And so we'll be moving into doing that.
So with the event you've got coming up next year, how can people, is there ways that people can sign into it or sign up to it or get involved? There's
always ways to get involved. I've like roped poor Ian into countless events, which you're really looking forward to, of course.
I actually am. I really am.
I think the Wildlife Festival will be wonderful. It's like after such a long year of COVID and everything, to get everyone together again, to get the community out running events, because that's what we're best at, you know. It's what, like, we're getting people together. People are doing stuff in growing veg polytunnels down in Barra, and they're going to do some cooking classes with the veg that they grow in the polytunnels. You know, there's all these wonderful things that are happening. So the Wildlife Festival, it's still just in the feasibility study stage. So I'm writing up the final report for it. But basically, anything, once we get funding for it, I'll send through some information to yourself, Ian, and then just let you know about it, because there'll be more scope for people to get involved if they want to. If you want to go and say, come along and plant some trees, you know, I think that'd count as a wildlife festival event. Get some free labour.
So Sue, you may be best to wait till next year.
have an army of volunteers.
Number 24, I live at.
Right, I'll see what I can do.
Yeah.
But yeah, we just look out for that. Get involved in events. There'll be plenty scope, I think, for putting on some additional events as well. So anything we've done just now is just sort of putting together a provisional program of events. So it can change, it can evolve. So if you've got ideas, I'm sure people will be in touch. RSPB are going to put in place like a community engagement officer to take it forward, which is great to see, like another job for the island. And somebody is going to develop the festival and deliver it. So there'll be plenty of scope, I think. From then there'll be like a Facebook page created and all sorts of things, or that's the plan in the next couple of months or so to move that forward.
So myself, Anne and Pippa, we're all part of the Shore Watch project.
Oh, really?
Yes, Shore Watch site is Rodal.
Oh, fantastic. I think we only had the Eel and Glass Shore Watch, but if you're interested in doing one at Rodal, that would be amazing.
No, it is one. It's been in.
Yeah, but we're sorry.
Carry on, Pippa.
No, it's you. You carry on.
Do you mean an actual event at the festival, Robyn?
Yeah. So it'd actually be sort of, so loads of people are running events themselves anyway, but if they wanted to come under like the umbrella of the festival and offer an event as part of it.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So actually, maybe I could get your email address off Ian and I can just send you through like some of the dates of the festival. But essentially it's just, the festival's running from the 25th of June to the 2nd of July next year. And it just be a case, it's broken into themed days. So we'll have like a coasts, sea animals, you know, a crofting one, a macher one. So we just like would fit you guys into any of those days. And if you're happy to do a shore watch, then that would be absolutely brilliant.
Good.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, lovely. Because we don't actually have that much down in South Harris, so it'd be really nice to have an event down there as well.
That'd be good. Yeah, it'd be great. We see porpoises are our main one, but we should be seeing minke whales now and dolphins as well. And
just showing off. No, that sounds fantastic. So tree planting, shore watch. Anything else you need done, Ian? Flower planting.
Yeah, I think yeah, I've got some ditches that need dug as well. So I mean,
excellent.
Plenty of work.
Yeah, I think ditch digging might be a hard sell.
Yeah.
Maybe. There'll be cakes. So
Test your marketing skills.
Exactly.
It'll test your marketing skills. Big ditching done.
I think so.
Yeah.
But we'll see how it goes. So, anyway, does anybody else have any other questions for Robyn or?
No, just to say thank you very much.
Yeah,
very
really
interesting.
good.
Yes,
And add Pippa onto your list because she came in late.
Okay.
After we have stuff now. So thank you very much. Thanks to Robyn.
Thank you, Robyn.
Thank you very much, guys.